Hi, this is Kim Gallen with the Black Press Research Collective, and I'm here today with Khuram Hussain, who is a former New York City school teacher, but currently an assistant professor of education at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. He is an expert on the Black press and the radical Black press, and he received his PhD in 2010 from Syracuse University, Cultural Foundations of Education program. And his research focuses on the capacity of schooling to both reproduce social inequity and serve liberatory ends. His current research deals with the historic contribution of the radical Black press in reimagining public education as critical, democratic, and multicultural. Welcome today, Khuram. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much, Kim.
Good. I'm glad you made time out of your busy schedule to talk with me today about the Black press. And I'm particularly interested in speaking with you today because your work really deals with an aspect of the Black press that we don't think about when we think about the Black press. We think about the great and really foundational papers like the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, Philadelphia Tribune, if we're thinking about local papers, the Baltimore Afro-American, and of course we always go back to the foundational paper at Freedom's Journal. But you do something a little bit differently in your research, and I think it's great that you're going to talk with us about that. So can you talk to us about your research, specifically on the newspaper Muhammad Speaks, and trace us through the development of this paper and how it fits with the Black press tradition in the United States?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you listed some of those papers because the founders of Muhammad Speaks really saw themselves in the light of that tradition. I think the story starts with Malcolm X, really, more than any one single figure in terms of the culmination of a set of ideas in the body of a newspaper. Even while Malcolm X was in prison, he was involved in using press to try to voice protest, to voice concern about injustice and organize people around a certain set of ideas. And when he joined the Nation of Islam, the Nation of Islam outreached to Black press like the New York Amsterdam News and the Pittsburgh Courier in order to voice some of their religious content. So essentially the speeches of Elijah Muhammad would be published in the Black press. So there was a long history both within the organization as well as Malcolm X in particular, recognizing the value of the Black press in Malcolm's terms is really the only venue to articulate the true plight of African Americans was through the Black press. And so by 1960, Malcolm had really come up with a design for a paper that would be distributed by the Nation of Islam, so they wouldn't have to look externally for places to voice the organization's views. But it's not just the organization's religious views that Malcolm is interested in. Very early on, the paper initially named Mr. Muhammad Speaks represents not just the speeches and teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, but also news on housing discrimination, police brutality, and other issues of concern for African Americans living in New York City. And so, especially for Black Harlemites, where the paper was largely circulated, this was a really popular source. And it was so popular that within a year, the paper became a national press. It was moved to Chicago, where it was distributed nationally and internationally. And there's a couple really interesting things that happen, some by intent and some by circumstance, that make it a unique press. Malcolm was always interested in getting really high-quality journalists and editors at the paper. He had approached James Baldwin to be the first editor-in-chief, and Eric Lincoln, who wrote the best-selling book, The Black Muslims, also worked at the paper. And there were very few Muslims that actually worked as editors at the paper. I mean, even Malcolm, who started the paper, essentially, handed it off in 1961 to Dan Burley and Richard Durham in Chicago. And there's a couple of really interesting reasons for this. One was the nation was still growing. It didn't have a lot of members that were journalists. And secondly, after Malcolm and everything that happened in terms of the break with the Nation of Islam, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad really wanted to be watchful, according to several of the former editors, of any one member of the organization gaining too much influence. And so by circumstance and intent, they ended up getting this cadre of progressive, justice-minded, high-quality journalists writing and essentially running the paper. And so in a few short years, the paper becomes this widely distributed, high-quality journalistic enterprise that oftentimes we associate with being just the voice of the Nation of Islam, but it really was a journalistic endeavor, and as a journalistic product even. You can see how remarkable it was, and as a historical product, it's really extraordinary as well.
So that completely complicates the history of black Muslims, and particularly the Nation of Islam, when we think about this newspaper as bringing in all these different actors who aren't necessarily religiously aligned with the paper, right? It's political. So when I think of a paper like Muhammad Speaks, my first instinct is to think of it as a religious paper. Is it a religious paper, or do you see it doing other sorts of things during this time period?
It's such an important question, and I think the answer is yes and no.
Okay.
It's certainly a religious paper because the editors were expected to very carefully edit the actual speeches of Elijah Muhammad and to put them in sort of the center of the paper, prominently, oftentimes highlighting on the front of the paper the story or the theme. Images of Elijah Muhammad or of members of the Nation of Islam oftentimes were splashed on the cover. And the cover is this tabloid-sized paper, and so they're often very colorful, literally, in terms of the actual tones that they use. And so, in that sense, it was definitely a religious paper. Also, people contributed, their experiences as members of Nation of Islam in the paper as letters to the editor, and there were extensive pieces that were published there. But it was also a paper that included, a vast amount of coverage of revolution in Congo, of, issues with, police brutality and, even, inequality in schooling. And so they were doing a lot of coverage on the ground, and they had a lot of freedom to do so. You would have, journalists come in, and, Elijah Muhammad would individually interview these journalists, and this is something I heard from a couple of them, is that they were told that your job is to go out and to tell the truth and bring freedom and justice to African Americans. Mm-hmm. And so the truth for Elijah Muhammad was not just his religious teachings, but it was also the African American perspective and coverage of stories that weren't getting a lot of voice in the mainstream press. And so essentially, once they got that blessing from Elijah Muhammad, these editors, most of whom were not Muslim, were sort of free to run the paper and to guide their staff in a way that they thought was most appropriate. And oftentimes that was towards a very progressive and journalistically excellent analysis of social issues and events that they thought were pertinent to the black freedom struggle of the moment.
So tell me something, how is the paper then being funded? I can't imagine that you had advertisers breaking down the border to advertise in Muhammad Speaks during the 1960s. I mean, they barely want to advertise in black newspapers in general. So how is this organization functioning economically?
So this is one of the most stunningly impressive, and perhaps accidentally so, aspects of the paper, is that in part because of the political economy of the Nation of Islam, they're really interested in supporting black businesses, and so they had little interest in getting corporate advertisers anyway, and I don't think corporate advertisers wanted to touch the Nation of Islam.
Sure.
And so their funding was twofold. The largest was the actual circulation of the paper itself. And so all members of the Nation of Islam mill members were required to sell a certain number of the newspapers every week. And so those papers were sold mostly on street corners in front of churches and civic centers, and in front of the Urban League and NAACP offices throughout major cities throughout the United States. And those papers circulated so well that they were able to make a substantial amount of financial income from them. In fact, they were able to fund the rest of the organization's operations largely on just this one thing.
Wow.
And so when Elijah Muhammad says that the paper was his best minister, I mean, it was not just in terms of getting his voice out, but also in terms of running the whole organization or supporting the whole organization financially. But the challenge there with that circulation is that it isn't solely people circulating the paper. Some of them are just paying their dues and not necessarily circulating all those papers. Right. So a lot of the other revenue that comes in is from local businesses, and that's really fascinating because one of the first things that I noticed about the paper is it's a national paper, but when you look at the ads, it'll be Amy's clothing store in Chicago. Right. Or it'll be a chiropractor in Los Angeles, and so you have local advertisers of local businesses in a national paper, and that reflects to me how community-oriented the paper was, how driven by community interest, because businesses understood that this paper was going to be read by their patrons wherever they were in the country, and so there's this incredible sort of grassroots approach to marketing that really takes effect in the paper. And so I think that the economics of it really reflect the actual impact of it, who was reading it, because why would you advertise a bakery on the south side of Chicago in the New York Times, right? You wouldn't do that, but this is a national paper, and people did do that.
Yeah. So I want to go back to these various actors that are all part of this paper. And I want you to help me understand what that means for something like education, right? And the voices that weigh in on educational policy through Muhammad Speaks, and how it creates a particular discourse around education during this time period.
So there's, I think, two very powerful things that the paper does through the actors that are involved with the paper. One is because they're so grounded in communities. They literally have bureaus in major cities throughout the United States. Whenever any social issue emerges, they're right there on the ground when it happens. So when you have educational issues like the emergence of black student protests in the late 1960s, they don't have to fly or bus anyone in. Right? There's someone there in D.C., there's someone there in New York, there's someone there in Chicago or Los Angeles that can do the coverage on the ground. And so what you get is a very intimate connection to these historical moments of educational reform. And so their coverage is really about it to some degree, giving the voice or expanding the voice of students and parents and families that are at the ground level really concerned with educational problems. And what you see emerge is fascinating, because even though a lot of the contemporary debate in the early 1960s, right, especially 1960, 1961, 62, is around equitable integration, right, or equitable desegregation, really. And Muhammad Speaks is right there on the ground, and so they're able to bear witness to the ways in which desegregation is not happening in a fair way, but also to say, here's a range of other issues that African American families are concerned with. They're not just concerned with desegregation of students. They're also concerned with representation of black teachers and administrators. They're concerned with having some voice and control over how their schools function. They're interested in the content, right? Like what kids are being taught, what students are being taught in school, and the need for that to be fair and equitable. And so they take the sort of the narrative of desegregation versus segregation and the black freedom struggle that is pushing against that and broadens it. It makes the understanding of historians of education richer, because we can see that, in the words of Jack Doherty, it was more than one struggle. that the effort to attain educational opportunity and equality of educational opportunity wasn't just about one single thing, but it was diverse. And they get that, and they get it with richness and through the voices of families.
Yeah.
And there's a second part too, but go ahead.
No, well, I was going to say that casts the civil rights movement, particularly around education, but also other issues in a whole different sort of light when we look at it through the lens of Muhammad Speaks, right? Because we are seeing, multi-layered conversations around education couched in the Nation of Islam and then from a black nationalistic perspective before many people even think about black nationalism in the United States in terms of what we think in the latter half of the 20th century.
Absolutely. And they're asking really good and important questions, right? They're asking questions about, okay, so once we integrate these schools, what are kids actually going to learn?
Yeah.
Right? And how are they going to interact with each other?
Yeah.
So they're really asking tough questions, and it's a lot of what they're hearing from communities that they're voicing back. And they're voicing it back in the standard English as part of a dominant discourse. These are college-educated professional journalists that are giving voice to community frustrations by some people in communities that aren't necessarily articulating it in that kind of language, so they're able to frame it in the dominant discourse. Right. While also bringing in people that are just giving voice to it, literally in their own words, as Malcolm says, in a language that everyone can understand. Yeah. So they're making that really accessible. And I think we're still confronted with a lot of these questions of, what do we do in communities that we're trying to reform, right? When we're not really interested in what they have to say about what reform should look like. Yeah. Right. I mean, there's a part of the black nationalist discourse here that is vigorously interested in a more democratic outcome for schools, and those questions are really important. So even if you don't ascribe to black nationalism, and none of the early journalists really did, or at least the editors did. Even if you don't ascribe to it, it gives you a set of really good critical thinking questions to ask about what happens when we lose all of our black principles. What happens when there isn't a governance board that's made up, at least in part, of families and communities in which a school is embedded. And those aren't just black nationalist questions. They're democratic questions, but they're coming out of black nationalist discourse.
So. Oh, I'm sorry. You said there was a second part of
the second part. I'll just touch on it briefly because I think this is fascinating. Is that starting with especially with Richard Durham, there was this commitment to make the paper itself an educational source, and that it would be, as one contributor that wrote a letter to the editor, as a white college student wrote to the paper. He said, "I read the paper every week because it is an education in itself." And he was talking about the kinds of histories that are included. There was these illustrated stories of Frederick Douglass or passages from W.E.B. Du Bois that were included in the paper, and oftentimes they were complemented by a crossword puzzle of famous African explorers and inventors, and so you'd use your references from other papers to be able to use it. And there's evidence that the newspapers are actually being used in classrooms throughout the United States. Yeah. So it was a supplement for what essentially was a monolithic, monocultural history textbook that kids were getting in schools, and so they wanted kids to have a more multicultural history, and they're like, but they want their parents to have it too, and so this was their way. And Richard Durham, from what John Woodford told me, was voracious in terms of reading. He would read textbooks and journals and academic studies on textbooks, and then publish them, in summary to give people access to a rich multicultural history. And so that is a piece that I think is really important too, that it served as its own history textbook.
Yeah. I'm thinking back to when I was younger, and I think a lot of people's frame of reference around the Nation of Islam and newspapers that come out of the organization really is generational. So in my generation, I remember seeing The Final Call, right? And seeing these, well-dressed men standing at intersections selling with bean pies, The Final Call. So I think a lot of our audience may have that memory also. So what is the relationship between Muhammad Speaks and The Final Call?
This is such an important question because it's actually not just a single linear connection. There's a little bit of a split that's important to note. In the mid-1970s, after Elijah Muhammad passes away, his son is given the mantle of leadership for the Nation of Islam. And very shortly thereafter, he starts to move the organization towards what some would describe as Sunni Islam or mainstream Islam. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that changes in that movement is the newspaper. It's renamed for a time Bilalian News. Bilal was a beloved African companion of the Prophet Muhammad, the Arab prophet from 1400 years ago. And so here you have a reference to that Muhammad, not Elijah Muhammad, but the Muhammad that was the founder of Islam at large. And the movement starts to become more internally oriented in terms of developing and celebrating community needs. And a lot of the critique of dominant society, white supremacy, imperialism, police brutality, segregation, those things start to sort of fade out. And it becomes much more focused on cultivating communities. The newspaper reflects that. Bilalian News and then the later Muslim Journal both reflect much more on things that are going on in the Muslim schools that they've established, or important religious teachings that will help clarify people's faith. And so it becomes more religiously instructive. Now, at a very short time after this movement, Louis Farrakhan essentially leaves that organization and does, in his words, essentially a revival of the what he describes as the original Nation of Islam. So he renames it the Nation of Islam because they had sort of moved away from that name, with the Muslim community.
Sure.
In the West, under W.D. Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad's son, and so that is in many ways an effort to sort of go back to that kind of critique and structure. And while some people move along with Louis Farrakhan, a lot of the members of what one might call the New Nation of Islam are new to the organization itself. So a lot of young people come in, and the paper that they claim is called The Final Call. And The Final Call was a newsletter from the 1930s onward that was distributed by the Nation of Islam. So it wasn't a newspaper as you might think of a newspaper, but it is now, both in terms of its physical form and in terms of its online iteration, which again tries to sort of honor that tradition of both providing religious instruction from Louis Farrakhan, but also critical analysis of domestic and international issues. A colleague recently told me that they thought that the best coverage that they saw on Libya was done by The Final Call. And so they're still sort of involved in that way. Yeah. And they still vend the papers the same way, with men dapper on the street doing hand-to-hand circulations. Now, that doesn't take away from the fact that the Muslim Journal still maintains a sense of heritage with the original Muhammad Speaks, because Muhammad Speaks was very interested in community power and cultivating community resources and honoring the voices of community leaders. And so both papers also have former journalists and writers. So you have, for example, Askia Muhammad, who was a writer he was an editor. He's the first Muslim editor of Muhammad Speaks, and he comes on as the editor or one of the important contributors to The Final Call. And you have people like Gates Kashif, who was a journalist for Muhammad Speaks, who comes on to the Bilalian News. So you have people from that tradition move into these two splits. But I think it's an important one because sometimes we think it's just a continuity, but actually there's an important split.
Right, yeah. And the papers represent that split. You talk a lot about the individual actors. Can you talk a little bit about your methodological approach in terms of talking to these people, and just how did you get in contact with all these people? Did you just pick up the phone and say, "Hey, I want to talk about these papers"? I'm really interested in that approach and how those interviews went. I mean, you essentially have done an oral history.
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
And so, yeah, I kind of let them tell their stories. I wanted them to talk and talk and talk, and I wanted to touch on certain aspects of their experiences. I wanted to know why they joined the paper, and I mean, especially you've got, folks that were coming into the organization that didn't have a religious affiliation. I mean, when you look at like the Black Panther, I think other than Du Bois, there was no other non-member that was a chief editor for the Black Panther Intercommunal News. But here, the first half of the paper's life cycle is all non-Muslims, and that was something I wanted to unpack. I wanted to have them tell their stories, and it was fascinating. I mean, most of them came from some kind of social justice background. Dick Durham was a CIO, labor organizer. Dan Burley was a writer for the Chicago Defender, and had also been running a popular radio series in Chicago that had to do with desegregation and the push against desegregation. So they came from these kinds of backgrounds, and they were interested in doing that kind of work, and then they got into the business of being journalists and ran into the problem of advertisers, the problem of, oh, you can't talk about that. John Woodford was writing for Ebony, and he wanted to run a story. He ran a survey of people that didn't vote for Johnson. And Ebony's like, no, this is, Johnson is someone who's sympathetic, and our advertisers, really appreciate him. And so they felt very uncomfortable. And so he didn't even have a political agenda. He's like, I just want to tell the story of what our readers think. I want to tell them back what they think, right? That's all I want. And so he was finding those kinds of limitations. Askia Muhammad, he was at Newsweek, and he was, doing stories on, he was doing a story on what people were naming their children. And what he found was they weren't naming their children after civil rights leaders, but they were looking towards African names. And Newsweek felt very uncomfortable. They didn't like this narrative. They liked the civil rights narrative. If he had come out with, parents that were naming their kids Martin, that would have been one thing. But if they're going to be naming them, Patrice, Lumumba, that's not something we want. You don't want that in there. And so, they constantly, were caught in this sort of limitation. Got to the papers, and they were able to really explore. So I really wanted them to tell their stories about how they got there. And I think we shared this sort of mutual agreement that this was an important paper that has been forgotten.
Why? That's my question. Why have these papers in this Black press tradition, why is it missing from the historiography?
That's a great question, and I, the old adage, the newspapers are the first draft of history, and so Roger Straitmeyer adds to that radical Black press were dismissed by the mainstream press of their day, and press historians dismiss them in kind today. And I think that there's two important reasons for that. One is, and this is again my speculation, one is that the papers were really sort of sensationalist with a lot of their rhetoric and imagery, especially on the front cover. Look, this is what gets our attention when we're watching a television commercial. This is the kind of flash and color, and so they really wanted to exploit that because they are really living in the moment. I mean, they've got to move these papers every week. You've got to get people's attention on the street, and you've got to have something that's going to do that. Think of like the New York Post, for example, right? Kind of flash. And so I think that it's easy to look at that, give it one look, and assume that that's what you're going to find in the interior, is that it's going to be just flush with rhetoric that's sensational and divisive and polarizing in some ideological fashion. But you thumb through the pages, and that's not what you find. And that's not when you have people doing mail order subscriptions for these papers at the the NAACP headquarters, or the Urban League headquarters in major cities, that people are really interested. As Dave Kashif once told me, a city councilman in D.C. said, I don't agree with the Nation of Islam, necessarily, but this is really important information.
Yeah.
I'm not getting it anywhere else. So people really saw this as a vital source of knowledge, and yet that's been lost. I think it's part of that. It's part of just the judging a newspaper by its cover, literally.
Yeah.
And I think the second part is that circulation and the conversation around that circulation hasn't been really interrogated enough, because there's a claim by many of the editors and others in the organization, the Nation of Islam, that the paper was at its peak circulating 250,000 papers a week.
Yeah.
So this is like, in terms of the history of the black press, you know better than anyone what that really would mean, right? In terms of circulation. Now, there's a understandably reason to question that number, right? Because here you have men that are being told to sell this paper, and some of these men are professionals, and they can afford to just buy the papers and just throw them in the trash, right? So they've just got to show
all my papers. Right.
So look, I sold 100 papers, and so there's that, and that, for some people this may not be a task that they're particularly enamored by. Some people may feel like they're glorified paper boys, and that's not a position that they want to find themselves. Other people are very proud. And I mean, one of the things I loved about Askia Muhammad was, as a member of the Nation of Islam, he had circulated the paper himself. And so, I asked him what he was most proud of in terms of his participation. And he said that, every week I gave the men that were on the street something that they could circulate, that they could be proud of.
Yeah.
That I gave a quality product. I wasn't giving them some diminished piece of just, trash that they were pushing. That there was something good, and so I think that there is a reason to be, kind of critical of that circulation. But on the other side, when we know that the organization was being funded by the papers, when we know that local businesses were patronizing the paper, when we know that there's references to the paper, throughout African American organizations, we have to also, I think, give a little bit more credit to how circulated it was, so that even if those numbers are less than what was reported, that there is perhaps more to be understood, because it's hard to audit papers that aren't vended through traditional means.
Right. I mean, a lot of the auditing comes from advertisers who want to see how well the paper sells in order to figure out if they're going to advertise there.
And when you're a mom and pop and you don't really worry about that, you just know the paper's around a lot, and you're willing to put in, the $10 or whatever it costs.
Yeah, I mean, what we find with the early 20th century black press, the sort of golden age of the black press up until World War II, is that those papers, one paper could circulate up to like 8 or 12 times. So in some ways, the circulation may be underreported when you think about those sort of circulation patterns and movements. But hey, I have to ask you this question as someone who does gender and take gender very seriously. Where are the women in these papers Muhammad Speaks? Are we seeing women editors or a woman's page? I mean, where do women fit in this story?
It's a really important question, because especially in the early period of the Nation of Islam and of Muhammad Speaks, the Nation of Islam's sort of gender segregation as a sort of an expression of religious modesty was at play in the paper, and so there were women working at the paper. There were a couple prominent civil rights leaders that were participating in the paper, and in a variety of functions, but not as editors. And so one might imagine this smoke-filled, confined space where a lot of the editors were doing their work, and so for the higher ups in the Nation of Islam, that didn't seem like an appropriate encounter point. And so it wasn't necessarily that women couldn't do the work, but that commitment to segregation really informed who served as editors. But with that said, there's and I don't want to undermine the significance of that is a very significant reality.
Yeah.
And we see with other papers like the Black Panther Intercommunal, when female editors come in, there is important and dynamic shift in the operations. So, I don't want to undervalue the significance of that. But with that said, there's a lot of women voice in a couple different ways. One is through special contributions. So there's extensive writings, essays, and letters to the editor that are contributed by not only female members of the Nation of Islam, but non-members of the Nation of Islam that are speaking back. There are also regular contributions, especially you see female leaders in the educational realm of Muhammad Speaks, because Muhammad Speaks ran their own parochial schools. A lot of the teachers and administrators were women. And the head of the parochial schools, Sister Christine Johnson X, was very vocal in the paper, and so she published at length. She had a PhD, I believe, from Columbia, and so she would write about very academic issues in this very accessible way. So I think the paper must have been very excited, especially with its interest in education, or its interest in educational issues, very excited to have someone so proficient and so communicative in the paper. And so you have women that play a prominent role in the paper on a regular basis. But that, I think, would have been quite interesting if there had been even one female editor. I think the dynamic would have been interesting to observe.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to us today. I know you'll be writing a piece for the BPRC, and I forgot to tell our viewers that you are now one of the newest members of the BPRC, and I think I know Maura and I are really looking forward to you adding a different perspective and helping sort of to round out, some of the things that we're interested in talking about in terms of Black newspapers. But this has been a really, really great conversation.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Good. All right. Well, you have a good afternoon.
All right, you too. Take care.
Bye.